You may have heard me share this before, but years back in Austin, Texas, the news stations were covering the story of a man named Herbert Washington, whose coworkers pulled a practical joke on him, and it worked. And in fact, it got him so anxious and everything else, he ended up having a heart attack. So now, as the story goes, Herbert was a Christian, but he really believed in the rapture, but he was convinced that he was going to miss out, that somehow the rapture it would happen and he would be left behind. And all of his coworkers, they knew that that's how he felt, because he constantly talked about this and constantly talked about it. And so one day they all kind of got together, and so he went to the bathroom, and when he came back from the bathroom, they were gone, all of them. And they staged their clothes. They had their overalls in certain places. They had uniforms here and there. Clothing would just be sitting there on a forklift, like somebody was sitting in the clothing, and it just the person's gone. And all that was left was one Muslim worker there, who was very clear about his Muslim faith, and he was in on this, and he's like, I do not know where everybody went. I don't know. Everybody just gone. And so he was just really panicked and really freaked out. And so poor Herbert, he right there, he starts clutching his chest and he's screaming, I knew I'd be left behind. And so the reporters are at the hospital, they're interviewing him and his coworkers thought, look, we thought this would be funny. We didn't mean to kill the guy. But all that to illustrate that there is a lot of confusion and sometimes even panic when it comes to the subject of the rapture. Now, the return of Christ is mentioned in the New Testament at least 318 times. At least 318 times, which just goes to show us that one of the major doctrines, one of the major teachings of the New Testament is the return of Jesus Christ. And yet, many Christians are intimidated by this subject, and far too few Bible-believing Christians can explain what they believe about the return of Christ, let alone explain the other views about the return of Christ. And so in this seminar, we're going to attempt to clear up the confusion when it comes to the rapture. And hopefully make it less intimidating. So looking at your handout, let's look at what our goal is. Our goal in this seminar is to accurately present each position with respect to the rapture of the church in such a way that everyone understands exactly what each position is saying and why they are saying it. We will look at each view's strengths and weaknesses and then come to conclusions as to which theory we feel best fits the facts. So we'll look at all the theories, we'll look at the facts, we'll look at the strengths and the weaknesses, and then you can kind of decide which one fits the best, okay? So that's the goal. However, in interest of full disclosure, let me tell you what my view is. I've already made up my mind. I'm not taking the class going, boy, I hope I can figure this out. I've already studied this, and I've got my own opinion. And so in interest of full disclosure, I'll tell you what my own opinion, as well as the opinion of Calvary Chapel Brighton is, and that is that based on the evidence, when it comes to this event, I hold a pre-trib view of the rapture. I feel that that's the view that best lines up with the biblical facts. So pre-trib, simply to state that, it would be that Jesus is going to come and his church will be taken out of the world 7 years before the second coming of Christ to the earth. And so therefore that means that we as Christians are going to escape the great and terrible day called the Great Tribulation. However, I recognize that there are a lot of other Christians who are wrong. I mean, there are a lot of other Christians who have different views. Godly believers who disagree with that. And so I understand that, and although I joke that everybody has the right to be wrong, I do understand that. I have no problem with that. In fact, really because we're dealing with the prediction of the future, there's no way to be 100% dogmatic about one of these conclusions. And so, your view of the rapture, that is not an essential to the Christian faith. So whether you're pre-trib, whether you're post-trib, or mid-trib, or whatever it is, that's not considered an essential to the Christian faith. Now, an essential would be like the fact that Jesus came the first time and died for your sins. That would be an essential. That he was virgin born, that would be an essential. That the Word of God is the Word of God, that it's infallible, that would be an essential. Those are essentials. The timing of the rapture, that's a non-essential. So therefore, because it's non-essential, it's hard to be 100% dogmatic about that. And so, there's times that with each other or with other believers, we're going to disagree on this issue, and that's fine. We just need to be able to disagree agreeably. And we need to disagree with each other in a way that honors Christ, if that makes sense. So think of it this way. The rapture is a timing issue. I didn't put a little thing on there for you to fill out, but you might want to write that down. It's a timing issue. So, therefore, because it's a timing issue, it's not essential. What is essential, however, is to believe that Jesus is coming for his church, and to believe that Jesus is coming back literally to planet Earth. That there will be a second coming. Now, the timing of that part's not essential. But for example, there are cults, and one of the marks that they're a cult is they do not believe that Jesus Christ is coming back. Okay, and so when you get somebody that says, well, I don't really believe in the second coming, or I believe it's mystic, and I believe that's now you're kind of tampering with stuff. So what's essential is to believe that Jesus Christ is coming back, but the timing, that's a non-essential issue. Okay. Augustine put it this way. He said, in essentials unity, in non-essentials liberty, and in all things charity. Or another way to say it, in all things love. And so we have to disagree agreeably. And so we treat each other with love when it comes to some of those things. So that's it. In your notes, how does the rapture of the church fit within the 70th week of Daniel? So this is what we're going to start with. One of the key questions when it comes to respect to the timing of the rapture is how the rapture fits within the prophecy of Daniel's 70 weeks, particularly his 70th week. Okay? And so that's kind of what we want to tackle. In fact, let me put it this way. How one interprets Daniel's prophecy of the 70 weeks usually will determine what their view is on the timing of the rapture. So how you interpret Daniel chapter 9 and his 70 weeks, your interpretation of that usually determines how you think the timing of the rapture is going to end up. And so, therefore, this makes interpreting and understanding Daniel's prophecy one of the utmost important things when it comes to trying to figure out the rapture. So let's look at that. The great prophecy of Daniel's 70 weeks in your notes. Daniel the prophet had been praying about the future of the nation of Israel. And all of a sudden the Bible says that he was visited by the angel Gabriel, who gives him a prophecy of 70 weeks. We read about that in Daniel chapter 9, verse 24. I've got it up on the screen for you. I'm going to be reading out of the NIV, the nearly inspired version. Just kidding. But the NIV says, 77s are decreed for your people and for your holy city to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Verse 25. No one understands this. From the issuing of the decree to restore and to rebuild Jerusalem until the anointed one, the ruler, comes, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens, and it will be rebuilt with streets in a trench, but in times of trouble. And after 62 sevens, the anointed one will be cut off and have nothing. And the people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end will come like a flood. War will continue until the end. Desolations have been decreed. He will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to the sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out upon him. So what in the world does that mean? I have no idea. Let's pray and go home. Now, there's a few things we want to observe. From Daniel's prophecy, there are a few observations that we want to make. Observation number 1 in your notes. The prediction concerning Israel's future is divided into 3 periods. If you would, 3, write this part down, time periods. 3 time periods. So in the prophecy that we just read in Daniel chapter 9, what we find is that the future of the nation of Israel is being laid out for us. Daniel is told that the future will be divided up into 3 periods of weeks or sevens. Some translations say, 77s, and some say 70 weeks. It's the same thing. So it's broken up into 3 periods of weeks or sevens. For example, the first 7 weeks, or the first 7 sevens, is that first period. He says, there will be 7 sevens, right? So that's 7 times 7. And then there's 62 sevens. That's another period of time, or 62 weeks. And then there's 1 final week. So that's 1 7. You see that in Daniel's prophecy? You've got 7 sevens, you've got 62 sevens, and then you have 1 final 7. And so now, what you have to understand when you're reading prophetic literature is that the ancient Jews had a way of referring to a week in a couple of different ways. There was the literal 7-day week, like you and I would normally talk about. Okay, 7 days, make up a week. But then there was a prophetic week. A prophetic week would typically speak of years. And so it'd be a group of, instead of 7 days, it would be a group of 7 years. So obviously, common sense tells you that Daniel's prophecy was not talking about days. He wasn't saying, hey, there's a total of 490 days for your people, that's it. I mean, that thing would have been fulfilled like that. Okay? He's not talking about 7 days in a week, but rather 7 years. So there are, 7 sevens, there's 62 sevens, and then 1 7. And it gives you a total of 490 years. And so what we're dealing with is 3 periods of time in your handout. The first period, you write this down, is 49 years. Because he says there are 7 sevens. So that's 7 times 7. Everybody remember 3rd grade math? Okay, so you had 7 sevens, that's 49 years. Then the second period is 434 years. How do we know that? Because that is 62 sevens, or 62 times 7. And you can check my math later, but that's 434 years. And then the third period of time is just 7 years. Why? Because there was just 1 7 left. 1 period of 7 years left. And so 1 times 7 is 7. Okay? So when you add that up, 49 years plus 434 years plus 7 years, that's a total of 490 years. Everybody see that?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Nobody said there'd be math. So now, here's the important thing. At the end of the 490 years, this is when Jesus Christ physically comes back to the earth, sets up his kingdom on the earth, and everlasting righteousness prevails from that point forward. Okay? At the end of the 490 years. That's not the rapture, that's the second coming. Okay? So when Jesus comes and physically sets up his kingdom on the earth and rules and reigns, and there's righteousness on the earth from that point on, that's called the second coming of Christ, not the rapture. Okay? We're going to be talking about the rapture. Now, we've got 490 years. So in your handout, number 2, the start date is given to us in the Bible. The start date was given to us from the Bible. Okay? So the Bible tells us when the time comes to start counting this down. So you've got 77s, and you've got all these sevens, right? So you've got a total of 490 years, and it tells us that there's a specific event that'll happen when we can start the countdown clock. And so here's what we're told. We're told that there will be a command given to rebuild and restore the city of Jerusalem. So Daniel chapter 9 was telling us. There'll be a command given to rebuild and restore the city of Jerusalem. And when that command's given, that's when this clock starts. Now, by the way, that command to rebuild and restore Jerusalem, that was given back in Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 1. One of the shortest guys in the Bible, Nehemiah. Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 1. the command was given. By the way, the date that command was given on March 14th, 445 BC. March 14th, 445 BC. So on that exact date, that's when you can start counting the 490 years. Because the decree was given, remember, we've been talking about this in the book of Ezekiel. The Jewish people, they're brought captives to Babylon. Jerusalem's destroyed. The temple's destroyed. They're going to be captives for 70 years. And then at some point, a command is going to be given. It's given by Cyrus and then later by Artaxerxes. But a command's given to rebuild Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. When that command is given, March 14th, 445 BC, that starts the clock. Okay? So, when Jerusalem was restored and rebuilt, the first period of sevens, or if you would, the 49 years, that's when that ends. Then the next period of sevens, which is I don't know if I wrote my math right, 434 years, the 62 sevens, that brings us to the coming of Christ physically. Okay, so you've got 49 years, and then you've got the 62 sevens, and that would bring us to the coming of Christ. That brings us to the 1st century AD. Now there's some discussion on this among Bible scholars. Some, they discuss the exact timing. Some say, well, this brings us to basically when Christ was baptized. Others will say, no, this brings us to the triumphal entry. For example, it was Sir Anderson who came up with this in his book. Came up with this exact outline of how if you do the math based on the Jewish calendar, which is based on the lunar calendar versus the solar calendar. If you use the lunar calendar and you count this all up, it brings you from the signing of the decree to rebuild Jerusalem, 445 BC. From the signing of that decree, it brings you exactly to the day that Jesus rode in on a donkey on his triumphal entry. And so he kind of outlines that whole thing. So whether it was the date of his baptism or whether it was the triumphal entry, the 62 sevens bring us to the time of Christ, is the point. Okay? And so then all of a sudden, there's a gap. So we've got, you've got a total of 490 years. But so far, you can account for 483 of those years when you come up to the time of Christ. That means that there's 1 7 left. Okay? So we've had the 62 sevens. We've got the 7 sevens. But what we haven't had is that one final 7. So in between the 69th week and the 70th week, there's a gap. There's an interval time, number 3 on your handout. There's an interval. Now it's important for us to understand that the prophetic clock stopped during the life and ministry of Jesus. Whether it was at his baptism or whether it was at his triumphal entry, that part doesn't matter. But when you get to the life and ministry of Jesus, that brings us up to 483 years. That accounts for 7 sevens, which is 49 years, and 62 sevens, which is, 434 years. And so now we've got 1 7 left. So there's a gap. And so Daniel writes that there are certain things, certain events that have to take place during this gap. There are certain events that have to take place during this interval between the 69th week and the 70th week. For example, take a look at Daniel chapter 9, verse 26. We'll look at it in a couple translations. Daniel 9:26. It says, after the 62 weeks, the Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. And the end of it shall be with a flood, and until the end of the war of desolations are determined. The NIV, after 62 sevens, the anointed one will be cut off and have nothing, and the people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end will come like a flood. War will continue until the end, and desolations have been decreed. The New Living Translation. After this period of 62 sets of 7, the anointed one will be killed, appearing to have accomplished nothing. And the ruler will arise, whose armies will destroy the city and the temple, and the end will come with the flood. and war and its miseries are decreed from the time of to the very end. So now, if you notice, this is saying that after 62 sevens, there are a couple of things that have to happen. So it's saying between the 69th week and the 70th week, in this gap, in this interval, there's going to be at least two things that have to happen. Number one, it's actually listed as number 4 on your notes. The Messiah is going to die during that interval. The Messiah is going to die. Verse 26 told us that the Messiah will be cut off during this interval. So instead of Jesus coming and establishing his kingdom right then and there, which, by the way, which was what the Jews were hoping was going to happen. That's one of the reasons they missed him the first time as their Messiah, because they were expecting he was going to come and set up his kingdom right then, right now. They missed the fact that in Daniel chapter 9, verse 26, there was a gap between the 69th and 70th week. They missed the fact that Daniel said after 62 weeks the Messiah is going to be cut off, which is just a Hebrew colloquialism for dead. He's going to be killed. He's going to be murdered. They totally ignored that fact. They didn't want to see that their Savior, their Messiah, wasn't going to come and save them from Rome and set up his kingdom right then and there. And so instead of setting up his kingdom, instead, he's crucified. He would die. Daniel prophesied that in Daniel chapter 9, verse 26. As well as, and this is prophesied, by the way, in a couple other places, as well as Isaiah 53, verses 1 through 9. You might want to write that down. Isaiah 53, verses 1 through 9. And also Zechariah 12, verse 10. Zechariah 12, verse 10. Also prophesy that the Messiah is going to be cut off, that he would have to die first. Isaiah 53, verses 1 through 9. Zechariah 12, verse 10. So that's the first thing. So there's a gap between the 69th and 70th week. And in between that time, Daniel says at least two things have to happen. Number one, the Messiah has to be cut off. That's number one. But then number two, listed as number 5 in your notes, is that the city and the temple were to be destroyed during that gap, during that interval. And so during this interval, not only is the Messiah cut off, not only does the Messiah die, but the city of Jerusalem and the temple in Jerusalem are also going to be destroyed. Now listen, God always keeps his promises, right? I mean, he promised this to the prophet Daniel, and it happened. And we know shortly after Jesus was killed that the temple in 70 AD was destroyed. The Roman general Titus, he comes into Jerusalem. Later on, Titus, by the way, becomes one of the emperors of Rome. But Titus comes into Jerusalem. He tears down the temple. He destroys the city. Hundreds of thousands of Jews were slaughtered in the process. And they set fire to the city. And in the process, the gold that was in the temple started to melt. And when the soldiers saw the gold melting, it would kind of fill the crevices of the stones. They started overturning the stones so they could scrape up the melted gold. And that's why a lot of the stones were overturned. And yet the Bible prophesied that would have to take place. And so at least two things would happen during that gap. The Messiah would be cut off, and the temple would be destroyed. Now, it doesn't tell us that those are the only two things that are going to happen. It doesn't say that those two and only those two things are going to happen, and then the seventh final week will start back up. It just tells us there's going to be a gap. There's some kind of a gap between week 69 and week 70, and in between that gap, at least those two things are going to happen. But listen, we are still in that gap period right now. Why? Because the 7th year hasn't started yet. And so it's worth noting that the Bible, 2/3 of the Bible is prophecy. Half of those prophecies have been fulfilled. And so it stands to reason that if the first half have happened exactly the way God said that they would, then there's no reason for us to doubt that the second half won't happen exactly the way God says that they would. God keeps his promises. He came the first time just like the scriptures prophesied and said that he would. And you know what? The Bible says he's coming back a second time. Now sometimes people say, you Christians have been talking about that for 2,000 years and it still hasn't happened yet. Well, listen, 2 Peter 3:8, it says, with the Lord, a day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as one day. So yeah, it's been a little over 2,000 years for us, but it's been over just a couple of days in heaven. And so he keeps his promises. But what we can be assured of is that all these things that Daniel prophesied, they took place. The temple was destroyed just as it was prophesied it was going to be destroyed. But in point number 6 in your notes, there is a future 7-year period. We're waiting for that prophetic clock to start ticking again. And so today we're still in this gap, we're still in this interval between the 69th and 70th week. But there's one 7-year period that's left. It's often called the tribulation period. Let's look at Daniel's prophecy again. Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. He will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. On a wing of the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end is decreed and poured out on him. And so, the last 7 is kicked off by signing this decree. It's saying this ruler during this 7-year period, he will sign a decree, and that's what kicks off this last 7-year period. And Jesus kind of gave confirmation to this period. You know, as we've noted, it's necessary that there has to be a gap between the 69th and 70th week. If for any other reason, there had to be a gap so that the Messiah could be cut off and so that the temple can be destroyed. For those 2 reasons alone, we see that there was a gap. He says after 62 weeks, the Messiah is cut off, the temple is destroyed, and then the 7th week is mentioned. Okay, so there's at least a gap for those 2 reasons. But we're told that this time clock, this prophetic time clock, gets kicked off, but this event that sometimes has been called the abomination of desolation. Remember, Jesus talked about this in Matthew chapter 24, verse 15. He says, you will see an abomination of desolation spoken by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place. And then it says in parentheses, let the reader understand. Now, the abomination of desolation. So according to Jesus, there's going to be this abomination of desolation, which is what Daniel just wrote about. And yet, in Jesus' time, that had not yet been fulfilled. And so Daniel said, hey, look, the 70th week, or that last 7, that's going to start when this ruler comes on the scene and he signs a decree. He signs this document. And in Jesus' day, that still hadn't happened yet because Jesus was referring to it as still a yet future event. He says the abomination of desolation that Daniel spoke of, and he's talking about it. Look, it's still a future event. Now, what is this abomination of desolation? Well, this speaks of the Holy of Holies inside the temple being desecrated. And this is still a future event. But what Jesus says is that when you see it happen, when you see that the temple is desecrated, this abomination of desolation happens, then you'll know that that's in fact a sign of the second coming. Not a sign of the rapture. It's a sign of the second coming. It's a sign that the second coming of Jesus back to planet Earth is really close. So in your handouts, the beginning of the last 7 years, the 70th week of Daniel, according to Daniel's prediction, the 70th week of Daniel is going to begin with the signing of a decree, really a peace treaty. He's signing a peace treaty between him and the nation of Israel. And so you have this coming world leader who's going to sign this 7-year peace treaty, this 7-year decree between him and the nation of Israel. Now, of course, we know that coming world leader is none other than what the Bible calls the Antichrist. Now, trust me, he's not going to show up on the scene saying, "Hi, I'm the Antichrist. I'm here to fulfill the book of Daniel." No, in fact, the Jewish people, we're told, are going to believe that he's their Christ. They're going to believe that he's their Messiah. They've been looking and hoping that somebody's going to come and sign this document and help them to rebuild their temple. They're looking for this guy. And they get deceived by this guy. And he signs a 7-year peace treaty with them. But once that peace treaty is signed, you might want to write this down, that's when the prophetic clock starts ticking. So we got one period of 7 years left. And the thing that's going to start those 7 years, the thing that's going to restart the prophetic clock, is when the Antichrist signs that 7-year peace treaty with the nation of Israel. While the ink is still fresh on the page, you can start counting 7 years from that point. It'll be exactly 7 years from the signing of that document that Jesus Christ will physically come back to the earth, overthrow the Antichrist, and set up his kingdom on planet Earth. And so that's what restarts the prophetic clock, Daniel's 70 years. And then at that point, that's where many of the events that you read about in the book of Revelation take place. The seal judgments, the bowl judgments, and all these different things. All that takes place after the signing of that document. The Antichrist signs that document, 7 years begin. Okay? So here's kind of the scene. The scene is this so-called Antichrist, this world leader emerges on the scene, and he's in power for 7 years. And basically he promises he's going to help the Jewish people rebuild their temple, among other things. And he makes this treaty with them, this covenant with them for 7 years. But then halfway through, 3.5 years into it, after the temple's rebuilt, he then goes back on his word. He goes in and personally desecrates the temple himself by claiming he's God and demanding to be worshipped in that temple. That's what Daniel calls the abomination of desolation. He desecrates the temple, demanding to be worshipped. And when that happens, so first, at the beginning of the 7 years, he helps them rebuild their temple. Now the temple's rebuilt, and 3.5 years into it, he desecrates it. That marks the halfway point of the so-called tribulation. And sometimes you see the language change from the tribulation to the great tribulation at that point, 3.5 years into it. But for all that to happen, listen, for the Antichrist to come, for him to then desecrate the temple, there has to be a temple. Now, show of hands, how many went with us to Israel here? Just a little bit. How many of you saw an actual temple? Nope. We saw ruins of a previous temple, but there's no temple yet, right? And so this is why whenever you start seeing movement in this direction and they start talking about rebuilding the temple, the Jews will often call it the third temple. You've got David's temple, and then in their mind you've got Herod's temple, but they're looking for the rebuilding of the third temple. And they believe that there's a leader coming, and he's going to help them with this, and they believe that leader might be their Messiah. And they're willing to worship him. And so anytime that you see any movement in this direction to rebuild this temple, as Christians, that should get our attention. It should get our attention because it shows us that the clock is kind of ticking, that we're moving in that direction. Now, here's the thing. Conventional wisdom has always been that the temple cannot be rebuilt because of what's called the Mosque of Omar, the Dome of the Rock. Let me show you a picture of the Dome of the Rock. We've all seen that. It's iconic. Okay. Now, that's sitting right on top of when Herod rebuilt the temple, of where Herod would have put the Temple Mount. Now, the reason I said when Herod would have put that is because Herod's version of the temple was bigger than David's temple, the original temple. Which means that where Herod portrays the Holy of Holies being and the Temple Mount and all that being, that's not exactly where it was when David built it, because David's temple was smaller. The dimensions were different. Okay? Now, the reason I bring that up is because historically it's always been believed that to rebuild the temple, they got to get rid of that thing. They got to bulldoze that bad boy, and because they think it's sitting right on top of the Temple Mountain, right above the Holy of Holies. But, and by the way, you have to understand just how sacred that site is to the Muslims. the Muslims believe that that's where Muhammad ascended up into heaven. And so because of that, to them that is the third holiest site that they have on earth. And so they cherish that thing like you wouldn't believe. And so if you're going to rebuild the temple there, if you're going to remove that in order to build the temple there, I mean, listen, you try to remove that, all jihad is going to break out, okay? And so it's considered like that's impossible. But like I mentioned, David's temple was smaller. So because of that, they believe that that's not exactly where the Temple Mount was and where the Holy of Holies is. In fact, according to the Biblical and Archaeological Review, they revealed that Solomon's temple is actually 26 meters away from the Dome of the Rock, which means theoretically that the temple could be rebuilt without even touching, without even disturbing the Dome of the Rock. Now, what's 26 meters away from the Dome of the Rock? Let me show you the next picture. You see that the other little mosque that's circled there? That's called the Al-Aqsa Mosque, or the Dome of the Spirits. That's 26 meters away from the Dome of the Rock. And they believe that that would have been the original location of where David's Temple Mount was and where the Holy of Holies is. Now, it's still sacred to them, but it's nowhere near as sacred. I mean, all you need on this one is a heavy negotiator. You get the right negotiator in there, and we might be able to do something with that little tiny mosque thing. And so all they're looking for is the right negotiator. Now, by the way, as I mentioned that, those of you that went to Israel with us, you remember going to a place called the Temple Institute, which is run by a group of Orthodox Jews who are, they believe the third temple is going to be rebuilt. And they're ready for it. They're training the priesthood. They've got all the implements. They're breeding red heifers. They everything you need to have a temple. The only thing they don't have is a temple. But they believe they know where we're